This is my true story. I gave my son everything, my time, my trust, and my name. I believed he would protect me as I once protected him, but instead, he tried to erase me. He told the world I was mentally unstable. He told my friends I had lost my mind. He told the court I was unfit to live alone. For months, I lived under a cloud of shame and disbelief. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. When the time came, I stood before everyone and exposed him with his own words. Before I tell you how, please subscribe, because this story deserves to be heard. I spent my whole life working for one purpose: to give my son everything I never had. My hands built the home he grew up in. My sweat paid for the school that shaped his future. Every coin I earned was saved for him, not me. I didn't care about luxury. I cared about legacy. I wanted him to walk through life with pride, knowing his father had built the foundation beneath his feet. I believed that one day, when my back grew weak and my hair turned white, he would hold me up with the same love I had shown him all his life. From the time he was little, I tried to raise him not just with comfort, but with values. I taught him to be honest, to speak gently, to remember where he came from. When he fell, I was there to lift him. When he succeeded, I was there to clap the loudest. I never asked for much in return, only respect. Just a kind word, a call now and then, maybe a hand on my shoulder when the years started weighing me down. But somewhere along the way, something changed. The world outside filled his ears faster than I could fill his heart. He grew into a man with ambition, sharp, proud, and restless. I saw myself in him at first, but where my hard work came from love, his came from hunger. He wanted more money, more power, more recognition. I admired that drive, but I didn't see how it was slowly swallowing him whole. I thought the long nights he spent away were just part of building his career. I didn't realize they were also building a wall between us. Still, I never questioned his choices. I trusted him completely. When he started handling my finances, I felt proud, like I had raised a responsible man. I gave him my account access, my property files, my company papers. He told me, "You don't have to worry about anything anymore," and I believed him. I thought it was love speaking, but later I realized it was control. The same hands that once held mine in childhood were now quietly locking me out of my own life. Even when his tone changed, when he started talking to me like I was a burden instead of a blessing, I stayed patient. I told myself he was just stressed. Every father wants to believe his son will come around. That time will remind him of love. I told myself I must have failed him somewhere. Maybe I was too strict once, or too soft later. Maybe the distance was my fault. So I kept forgiving him. Every harsh word, every cold glance, I forgave it all. I remember one evening, sitting at the dining table, waiting for him to come home. The house felt too quiet, too large. I used to hear laughter echo through those walls, my wife's voice in the kitchen, my son's running feet, the sound of plates clinking during dinner. Now it was only silence. When he finally walked in, he didn't even look at me. Just brushed past like I was furniture. That was the first time I truly felt old. Not because of age, but because I realized I no longer mattered. Even then, I didn't stop loving him. I couldn't. Love doesn't turn off like a switch. It lingers, even when it hurts. I kept hoping that one day something would remind him. Maybe a photograph, maybe a smell of home-cooked food, maybe the sound of my cough. Something that would bring him back to who he used to be. But that day never came. He became successful. Big house, big car, big friends. People spoke his name with admiration, and yet I noticed that the more he gained, the less he looked back. Pride had erased gratitude. The world saw him as a man of success. I saw him as a man losing his soul. But I didn't interfere. I thought maybe time would teach him what I couldn't. I was wrong again. The day my wife passed away, I thought grief might bring us closer. Death has a way of making people remember love. But even then, his eyes were dry. He arranged the funeral quickly, efficiently, like a business transaction. No tears, no warmth, just logistics. I stood beside her coffin, my heart breaking. and he checked his phone between condolences. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just looked at him and realized that I had lost two people that day, my wife and the son she gave me. After she was gone, the house became even quieter. I began noticing things I had ignored before: papers missing, accounts moved, decisions made without my knowledge. When I asked small questions, he laughed it off. "You're too old to handle all this," he said once, half joking, half serious. That sentence should have warned me. But love makes you blind. I didn't see that he was slowly painting me as weak in front of others. Friends who once respected me started avoiding me. They whispered behind my back. Some asked gently, "Are you doing okay?" I didn't understand why at first. Then one of them told me that my son had been saying things, that I was forgetful, confused, not the same anymore, that I couldn't manage money or make decisions. My stomach turned cold. It wasn't concern he was spreading. It was character assassination. Slow, subtle, deliberate. The worst part wasn't hearing what he said. It was realizing how believable he had made it. He had power, confidence, and the world's trust. I was just an old man with shaking hands and a quiet voice. No one questions youth when it speaks about age. They assume it's truth. I watched my reputation crumble in silence. People began looking at me with pity instead of respect. That, more than anything, broke me. There's a kind of loneliness that comes when you're alive, but no one believes in your sanity. You start doubting your own mind. I would sit by the window, reading the same page over and over, wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe I was losing touch. Maybe I had truly become the fragile old man he described. But every time I looked in the mirror, I saw clarity in my eyes. My body was aging, yes, but my mind was sharp. The only thing fading was my faith in my son. Still, I didn't act. I waited. Because I believed truth always finds its way. I believed the world would see what I saw, eventually. But the world didn't. It only believed the loudest voice, and his voice was louder than mine. I was too late to realize that sometimes silence becomes a weapon against you, and that's exactly what he used. My silence. He started attending family events without inviting me, told relatives I was too tired or too confused to travel. He started signing my name on documents, making decisions in my place. I didn't notice at first, because he always said, "Don't worry, Dad, I've got this." But one day, when I tried to withdraw money from the bank, they told me my access was restricted, that my son had legal guardianship. I laughed at first, thinking it was an error. Then the laughter died when I saw the documents. His signature, my forged consent. My own blood had turned my love into a legal weapon. That was the day I realized I wasn't just being manipulated, I was being erased. And that realization changed everything. After that day, the silence in my home changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like it was watching me, waiting for something to break. My son began visiting more often, but not out of love. He came with papers, with lawyers, with soft words that hid sharp edges. He said he was helping me, that he was handling the stress for me. But every time he left, something else disappeared. An account, a document, a memory turned into doubt. It was a slow theft, not of money at first, but of reputation. And reputation is harder to rebuild than wealth. He began speaking for me, even when I was right there. When people called, he would answer and say, "Dad's resting. His memory isn't what it used to be." At first, I laughed it off. Maybe he was protecting me, I thought. Maybe he was trying to make life easier. But soon, the laughter stopped. Every conversation I tried to have ended with someone saying, "Oh, I heard you weren't well." The words spread like a fog, invisible but suffocating. My neighbors began to treat me differently. They spoke slowly to me, like I was fragile, like my mind had gone soft. The man who once led meetings, who handled company accounts with precision, was now being pitied. Even my old colleagues stopped calling, and when I reached out, they said things like, "Your son told us you're not keeping track of things anymore." That was when I realized the setup had begun, long before I noticed. It wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. He started accompanying me to doctor appointments, insisting that he needed to stay informed. I didn't resist. I thought maybe he cared. But soon, I noticed the doctors started asking strange questions. Questions that didn't fit my condition. Questions about confusion, memory loss, and paranoia. I looked at my son and saw him nodding in agreement, painting me as something I wasn't. I left those appointments with prescriptions I didn't need and a quiet anger I couldn't show. He was creating a story, a version of me that didn't exist. He took control of my medication, saying it was for my safety. I played along. I pretended to be too weak to argue. Because I knew, when a liar builds a trap, the smartest move is to let him think you've fallen into it. Every time he smiled and called me old man, I smiled back. Every time he told someone I was losing my mind, I nodded like it didn't matter. But inside, I was memorizing everything. Every date, every document, every word he said. Because when truth finally speaks, it doesn't need to shout. It wasn't just words anymore. He started taking over my finances completely. One morning, I received a notice from the bank. All major transactions required his signature. He had used legal tricks to make it look like I had voluntarily given him power of attorney. The signature on those forms looked like mine, almost perfect, almost. I kept that paper locked away. I knew I'd need it one day. He changed the locks on my office and told the staff I was retired. I hadn't even decided that. My desk was cleared, my files moved. Years of work, erased with one phone call. And no one questioned it because everyone believed him. That was the power he had, not over money, but over perception. Once people believe a lie, truth has to climb a mountain to catch up. Then came the visits from social workers. They asked gentle questions. Do you feel safe at home? Do you ever forget where you are? I understood then that the story had reached the system. He had reported me as unstable. My own son had planted the idea that I was losing my mind, and now it was being investigated. I smiled through every interview, answering clearly, calmly, deliberately. I wanted them to see what he didn't, that my mind was sharper than his conscience. At home, he began hiding things, my mail, my bills, even my phone sometimes. He said it was for my safety, but I knew it was to isolate me. Isolation is the first step to control. When people can't hear your voice, lies become the only sound they know. I felt like a prisoner in my own house. Every corner that once felt like home now felt like surveillance. He started bringing in advisors, strangers who came in suits, carrying folders, smiling too much. They spoke in half-truths, in rehearsed sympathy. I could see through them. They weren't there to help me. They were there to prepare the next step, to make me look incapable in front of witnesses. One even asked me to sign a few documents to simplify things. I took the papers, pretended to squint at them, then placed them aside. Later, when I was alone, I read them carefully. They were property transfers. My son's name was listed as beneficiary. I didn't sign. I kept the papers. That was the day my patience turned into strategy. He thought I was weak because I stayed quiet. He thought silence meant surrender. But silence is where patience gathers strength. I started keeping a small notebook, details of every event, every lie, every change in his behavior. Dates, witnesses, names. I wrote everything down in neat, steady handwriting. He thought I was losing my memory. In truth, I was documenting his downfall. Then one day, he brought a doctor to the house. Not a family physician, but a psychiatrist. The doctor smiled, asked polite questions, and scribbled notes. My son stood behind him, arms crossed, watching. The doctor asked about confusion, mood swings, and disorientation. I answered slowly, carefully, without anger. I could see my son smirking when I paused between words, thinking it was proof of his claim. But I wasn't pausing from confusion. I was pausing to make sure I remembered every word that came out of that room. After that visit, things escalated. My son started talking about arrangements, assisted living, moving me into a care home for my own good. I realized he wasn't just trying to control my life, he was trying to remove me from it completely. Once I was out of the house, he could declare full control over everything I owned. That was the real goal all along: inheritance before death. It was during those days that I learned what real fear feels like. Not the fear of death, but the fear of erasure, of being turned into a story you don't recognize. I would sit at the window at night, staring at the moonlight reflecting on the glass, wondering if I had failed as a father. How does love turn into this? How does a child learn to destroy the very man who taught him to stand tall? But fear didn't last long, because with fear came clarity. I realized that I couldn't fight lies with anger, only with truth. And truth needed proof. He had built his story carefully, but he had also grown careless with arrogance. He spoke too freely when he thought I wasn't listening. He whispered his schemes to people who thought I was deaf. That arrogance would be his undoing. I just needed to wait and watch. The day the court papers arrived, I wasn't shocked. Somewhere deep down, I had been expecting it. The document said I was mentally incompetent and requested full guardianship by my son. Reading those words was like reading my own death sentence, not of life, but of identity. He was trying to take away not just my money, but my name, my voice, my freedom. But the moment I saw the papers, I didn't panic. I smiled, because I knew something he didn't. I had already started recording. The morning the court papers arrived was quiet, too quiet. I remember the sound of the postman's footsteps fading down the path, the rustle of the envelope sliding through the door, and the way it landed softly on the floor. Something about it felt heavier than paper. My son's name was printed on the return address. That alone should have made my heart sink, but I was past fear now. I picked it up with steady hands, sat at the table, and opened it. Inside were pages filled with lies, cold, polished lies that looked official. Words like mentally unfit, incompetent, and guardianship request jumped at me. Each line felt like a betrayal signed in ink. I read every word slowly. He claimed I was unable to manage my own affairs, that I had shown signs of declining mental stability. He said I was paranoid, forgetful, and unfit to make financial or legal decisions. He even wrote that I had become aggressive toward caregivers. The lies were written so carefully that if someone didn't know me, they might have believed them. And that was exactly what he wanted. He was trying to destroy my credibility before I could even defend myself. For a long time, I sat there in silence, the pages trembling in my hands. I wasn't angry. I was disappointed. In him, in myself, in the years I spent teaching him values he never learned. I thought about all the times I had chosen to stay quiet to keep peace. I realized that my silence had become the soil where his deceit had grown. The more I forgave, the bolder he became. And now it had reached the point where he was trying to legally erase me. The next few days were filled with quiet preparation. I didn't tell anyone about the papers. I didn't call friends or relatives. I just observed. My son came over that week, acting cheerful, pretending nothing was wrong. He brought food, smiled too wide, asked about my health. Every word was a performance. I could see the tension in his eyes, the kind that comes from lying too long. He thought I hadn't seen the documents yet. I let him believe that. Because when you're dealing with someone who lives in deception, the greatest weapon is patience. I offered him tea that day, and as he sat across from me, I noticed how comfortable he looked in my house. Our house, the one I built. He leaned back, legs crossed, speaking about how times were changing, how it might be better if I let him handle everything for convenience. I smiled faintly, pretending to agree. In his mind, he had already won. He thought the papers were just a formality, that the court would sign them and hand him the keys to my life. But he didn't know that I was already 2 steps ahead. You see, I had spent weeks quietly recording his conversations. He never realized that the phone I always kept near me wasn't just for calls. It was recording every word. I had hours of proof. His voice bragging about how he was preparing to take over everything, how I was too old to fight back, how he had convinced people I was unstable. Every word, every cruel laugh, every whisper, captured. It wasn't anger that made me record him. It was self-defense. When the world won't believe your truth, you have to collect proof that can't be denied. But the betrayal went deeper than the papers. Over the next few weeks, I began to see how far he had gone. He had already started moving my assets, selling shares, withdrawing money, moving property titles to temporary trusts he controlled. He had used my forged signature in more than one place, and he had allies, people he paid to back up his story. Accountants, lawyers, even a doctor who had signed a false mental evaluation. The network of deceit was wide, but it all led back to him. My own blood had turned my life into his business. There was a night when I sat alone, reading old letters from my late wife. She had always believed that love could fix anything. I wondered what she would say now. Maybe she would tell me to forgive, to let go. But forgiveness, without consequence, only breeds more betrayal. I folded her letters gently and placed them back in the drawer. I whispered a promise to her photo that I would protect the dignity of our family, not through anger, but through truth. The first hearing was scheduled a month later. My son came to pick me up that morning, acting kind again, pretending to care. I looked at him, dressed in his perfect suit, smiling like a man of virtue. Inside, I knew that smile hid rot. He thought he had control of everything, the evidence, the narrative, the sympathy. What he didn't know was that the one thing I had left was the truth. And truth, when revealed at the right time, burns hotter than revenge. At the courthouse, I stayed silent during the introductions. He spoke for both of us, confidently describing my mental decline. He even produced witnesses, neighbors and relatives he had manipulated. Each one testified that I had seemed confused or forgetful. I didn't blame them. They believed what he told them. Lies are easy to believe when they come from a familiar face. When it was my turn to speak, my lawyer asked for permission to present new evidence. The judge nodded. I handed over a flash drive. Inside, it were hours of recorded conversations, his voice admitting to lying, scheming, and manipulating everyone. The courtroom fell silent when the first recording played. His voice echoed across the room, confident, careless, unmistakable. He was heard saying, "He doesn't even know what's happening. Soon, everything will be mine." The color drained from his face. He tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced him. The recordings played on, one after another, revealing everything: the forged documents, the fake doctor's notes, the bank transfers. His web of lies collapsed in minutes. The same people who had pitied me now looked at him with disgust. His confidence melted into panic. For the first time, he realized the man he thought was weak had outsmarted him with silence. I didn't celebrate that day. There was no joy in exposing your own child, only relief and sorrow. The court dismissed his claim immediately. The guardianship request was denied. Instead, the judge ordered an investigation into financial fraud and forgery. My son's empire of deceit started crumbling from that moment on. Friends turned away. Business partners stopped calling. The same community that once praised him now whispered behind his back. Justice had spoken, not loudly, but clearly. After the hearing, I walked out of the courthouse alone. The air felt lighter. For years, I had been carrying the weight of humiliation, the burden of disbelief. But that day, the burden lifted. Not because I won a case, but because I reclaimed my name. I proved that the truth doesn't need youth, power, or wealth. It only needs patience. When I returned home, the house didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt peaceful. I sat in my chair, the same one he once tried to sell, and closed my eyes. I thought of the long road that brought me there, the pain, the betrayal, the quiet strength it took to wait. I realized that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying someone. It's letting them destroy themselves while you stand strong. My son never came back after that. He moved away, ashamed, silent, forgotten by those who once admired him. But I didn't hate him. I pitied him. Because I knew what he lost that day wasn't just money or reputation. He lost his father's respect forever. And that is something no court, no lie, no scheme can ever restore. After the courtroom fell silent and justice finally spoke, I went home and sat by the window, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The light was soft, gold fading into gray, the kind of light that makes the world look honest again. For the first time in years, I felt peace settle into my chest. Not victory, not triumph, just peace, quiet, earned, deserved peace. My hands, once trembling from age and anger, now rested still. I wasn't thinking about the lies anymore. I was thinking about how long I had lived believing that love would always protect me, even when love had turned against me. In that silence, I began to reflect on everything that had happened. Not just the betrayal, but the small steps that led to it. Every time I had ignored the sharpness in his tone. Every time I had let him decide things without question. Every time I had told myself, he's just stressed, he'll come around. I realized that kindness without boundaries becomes a door for cruelty to walk through. I wasn't just betrayed by my son, I had betrayed myself by refusing to see it sooner. That realization hurt more than anything else. The house around me felt both familiar and foreign. The same walls that once echoed with laughter now stood in silence, carrying the weight of truth. I looked at the chair where he used to sit as a boy, his legs too short to touch the ground, his eyes full of dreams. I had once believed those eyes would carry my legacy with pride. Now they were eyes I couldn't even meet in memory without feeling the sting of what had become. But even then, I couldn't hate him. Love doesn't disappear just because it's not returned. It changes shape. It becomes quieter, wiser, distant, like a scar that no longer bleeds but still aches when it rains. Days passed slowly. Neighbors stopped by to ask how I was doing. Some offered sympathy. Some offered apologies. But I didn't need either. I had learned that pity is just a soft version of misunderstanding. They couldn't know what it feels like to raise someone with love and then watch that same love used as a weapon. I didn't explain anything to them. I just smiled and thanked them. Let them keep their version of the story. Mine was private, and I preferred it that way. Every night I would sit at my desk and write in my notebook, not about pain, but about lessons. I wrote that trust is a gift, not a guarantee. That silence is powerful, but dangerous when given to the wrong person. That respect is the only inheritance worth leaving behind. Writing helped me clear the fog from my heart. It reminded me that even though I had lost a son to greed, I had not lost myself. The court had returned my dignity, but reflection was returning my peace. Sometimes I would think about the moments before everything fell apart, the dinners we shared, the laughter that used to fill the house. I replayed those memories not to relive the joy, but to understand where it faded. Love doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes. One careless word, one selfish choice, one unspoken resentment at a time. My son's betrayal didn't begin with greed. It began with entitlement. Somewhere along the way, he started believing that my sacrifices were his rights, that everything I had built was his by default. And I had allowed that belief to grow by never correcting it. One morning, I went to the garden behind the house, the one my wife used to tend. The air smelled of earth and jasmine. The flowers were overgrown, wild, untended for years. I spent hours trimming, clearing, watering. As I worked, I thought of how love and gardens are the same. If you stop nurturing them, weeds grow. Lies are the weeds of love. They start small, barely noticeable, but left unchecked, they take over everything. That garden became my therapy. Every flower I revived felt like reclaiming a small part of myself that had been buried under years of disappointment. There were moments when loneliness tried to creep in, when the house felt too big, the nights too long, but I welcomed those moments. Loneliness teaches you to value your own company. It reminds you that peace doesn't come from being surrounded by people. It comes from being surrounded by truth. I stopped expecting phone calls. I stopped checking messages. I stopped waiting for him to apologize. Some people never look back because the mirror behind them is too painful to face. I realized I couldn't force repentance, but I could choose peace. A few months later, I met with my lawyer again. We finalized everything: the trust, the donations, the documents that would ensure he could never harm me again. I didn't do it out of revenge. I did it to protect the quiet I had finally earned. I divided my estate among causes that mattered: elder care, education for underprivileged children, medical charities. Every signature felt like a piece of my pain turning into purpose. If my son had taken my money through deceit, it would have died in his hands. But by giving it away in truth, it would live on. That was my redemption. In the evenings, I began to visit the town library again, a place I hadn't stepped into in years. I would sit by the window with a book and a cup of tea, surrounded by silence and stories. There's something beautiful about sitting among words when yours have been twisted by someone else. Books reminded me that truth doesn't vanish. It waits for someone brave enough to read it again. I found peace in that. Once, a young man at the library recognized me from the news, from the court case that had become local gossip. He approached me, nervous, and asked, "Sir, how did you stay calm through it all?" I smiled and told him, "Because shouting doesn't make truth louder." That was all I said. He nodded slowly, understanding more than he expected. That moment reminded me that wisdom doesn't always come with age. Sometimes it comes with scars. The seasons changed. The trees outside my window went from green to gold to bare, and yet I stayed constant, rooted, unshaken. Time, I realized, doesn't heal betrayal. It just teaches you how to live with it. I still thought of him sometimes, not with hatred, but with a quiet wish that life would someday teach him what I couldn't. Maybe one day he'd look in the mirror and see not the man he became, but the boy I once loved. On my desk sits a single photograph, him as a child, smiling, holding my hand. I keep it not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that love, no matter how broken, once existed. Because in the end, what defines a man isn't who betrayed him, but how he rises after being betrayed. I didn't rise with anger or revenge. I rose with silence, proof, and dignity. That's the kind of strength time can't destroy. And so I live quietly now. My days begin with coffee and end with gratitude. I watch the sunrise, listen to the birds, tend the garden, and write a little each day. I don't wait for visitors. I don't crave apology. I have learned that peace doesn't require closure. It only requires acceptance. I lost a son to greed, but I gained myself back through truth. And that, I think, is a fair trade. After the court case, I thought everything had ended. But life has a way of testing how deeply you understand peace. I realized that though justice had cleared my name, my son's lies had roots, long, tangled, reaching into people's minds. Some still whispered that I must have been confused, that maybe I had misunderstood my son's intentions. Lies are like stains. Even when you wash them, traces remain. So I decided I wouldn't just defend myself. I would uncover the full truth, quietly, completely. I wouldn't shout or seek revenge. I would expose everything through patience and proof. It began one quiet evening when I was cleaning my desk. I found an old recorder, the kind with a small red button and a soft hum when turned on. I had used it years ago for work meetings. I turned it on, half expecting it to be broken, but it still worked. The sound that came from it reminded me of purpose, calm, precise, unshakable purpose. I realized I didn't need to fight with emotions anymore. I had the one tool every liar fears: evidence. Over the next few weeks, I began to listen differently. I noticed things I hadn't before: the tones in people's voices when they spoke about me, the pauses, the hidden sympathy. My son still called occasionally, pretending to check on me. Each time, I recorded the conversations. He didn't know that every fake apology, every manipulative promise, every veiled insult was being stored. I wasn't collecting his voice for revenge. I was collecting it to protect the truth, in case lies tried to rise again. There was one call I'll never forget. He spoke about repairing our relationship, but slipped into arrogance halfway through. He said, "You were lucky I didn't take more." Everyone knows you'd have lost everything if I wanted to." He laughed at his own cruelty, thinking he was safe behind the distance of a phone line. But his words were captured, every syllable. That night, I sat in my chair, staring at the recorder, realizing that I now held more than proof. I held a mirror, one that would one day show him what kind of man he had become. Recording became routine. When he visited, I'd place the recorder beneath the newspaper, hidden among my reading glasses and notes. He talked freely then, about selling my assets, about manipulating relatives, about getting the rest once I'm gone. Each recording was a piece of a puzzle, revealing not just his deceit, but his pride in it. Pride is the loudest confession of guilt. I didn't stop him. I didn't warn him. I just let him talk. The quieter I became, the more he exposed himself. There were days when guilt tried to visit me, not his guilt, but mine. I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. After all, this was my son. The boy I had raised, fed, protected. The one whose first bicycle I bought, whose first heartbreak I comforted. But every time doubt entered, I remembered the courtroom, the lies, the forged papers, the look of triumph in his eyes when he thought I was too weak to fight. That memory reminded me that mercy for the cruel is betrayal of the innocent. So I continued, calmly, silently, with precision. One afternoon, I visited my lawyer. I told him I wanted to update my will again, not out of anger, but clarity. I handed him copies of the recordings, labeled carefully by date. He listened to a few, his eyes widening with disbelief. He said quietly, "This is undeniable." I nodded. "It's not revenge," I told him. "It's preservation. I wanted my legacy, my truth, to outlive the lies that tried to bury it." He understood. We locked the recordings away, with clear instructions on how they should be used if my son ever tried to reclaim control through deceit again. Outside of legal matters, I began to study human behavior again, something I had long forgotten I was good at. I observed people, their faces, their reactions, their hesitations. It's strange how betrayal sharpens the mind. I could tell now who believed the rumors and who didn't. I didn't confront anyone. I let time do the work. Truth doesn't need an audience. It needs endurance. One night, as I played back a recording, I caught something unexpected, my son mentioning a new scheme. He was planning to take out a loan using my old business credentials, claiming to be my legal proxy. I smiled faintly. That was his last mistake. I forwarded the audio to my lawyer, and within days, the authorities were informed. The investigation began quietly, like a whisper turning into a storm. I didn't need to raise my voice. The recordings did all the talking. Weeks later, an investigator came to visit me. He was polite, respectful. He asked a few questions and thanked me for cooperating. As he left, he said, "Sir, you did the right thing. You've saved yourself, and maybe others too." His words stayed with me. For years, I had believed exposing your own blood was a form of shame. But I learned that protecting the truth isn't betrayal. It's duty. The next time I saw my son was not in a courtroom or at home. It was at a bank. He didn't notice me at first. He was arguing with the manager, red-faced and desperate. When he finally turned and saw me, his expression froze. There was no anger in mine, just calm. I walked past him without a word, greeted the staff, and left. The silence between us said everything. That was the moment he realized his lies had no power anymore. In the months that followed, I began to heal, not physically, but emotionally. Healing from betrayal isn't about forgetting. It's about rebuilding what was left standing. I started reading again, cooking for myself, walking in the mornings. Small things, but meaningful ones. Every step reminded me that I was still in control of my life. He had taken my trust, but not my will to live. That was something no document could steal. I spent time with people who valued truth. Old friends who returned once they saw the headlines fade. Neighbors who now greeted me with respect again. Some apologized for believing the lies. I forgave them easily. They were just human, fooled by charm, blind to manipulation. What mattered was that I was seen again as myself, not as the man my son had tried to invent. Through all this, one lesson stood out clearer than any other. Silence is not weakness. It's a test of endurance. It's the weapon of the wise. If I had shouted when he first started lying, I would have looked angry, unstable, exactly how he wanted me to seem. But by staying silent, I gave him space to hang himself with his own words. And when the time came, those words became the rope of truth. Now, when I look back, I don't see a story of revenge. I see a story of revelation. My recordings didn't just expose him. They revealed who I had become. A man who chose wisdom over rage, proof over pain. A father who turned his suffering into strength. In my old age, I discovered that the greatest form of justice isn't punishment. It's peace earned through truth. The day of the hearing arrived quietly, without warning in my heart. The sky was gray, the kind that makes everything feel heavier. I remember waking up early that morning, sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. My suit hung neatly on the chair beside me, old, pressed, the same one I wore at my wife's funeral. It wasn't pride that made me dress well that day. It was respect, for myself, for the truth, for the years that led me to this moment. I wanted to walk into that courtroom not as a victim, but as a man reclaiming his dignity. The car ride there was silent. My lawyer sat beside me, papers in hand, speaking softly about what to expect, but his words were distant. I could hear only the faint hum of the tires on the road and my own heartbeat. After all the pain, all the humiliation, all the whispers, this was it. The moment when my silence would finally speak. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I was simply ready. The kind of readiness that comes from enduring too much for too long. When we entered the courtroom, I saw him, my son, my blood, my disappointment. He was standing near his lawyer, dressed immaculately, confident as ever. He smiled faintly when he saw me, that same rehearsed smile he had used to deceive everyone else. But I noticed something new in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. He thought this would be another easy win, another manipulation wrapped in polished lies. He didn't yet know that his downfall was already recorded, waiting to be played. The hearing began like before. His lawyer stood, painting the same picture he had drawn months earlier, an old man losing his grip on reality, confused, unstable, unfit to manage his affairs. They presented fake testimonies, carefully worded statements from people who once believed him. He spoke of my mental decline, my erratic decisions, my uncooperative behavior. Every sentence felt like a dagger, but I didn't flinch. I sat straight, eyes forward, hands folded, listening to the performance with the stillness of a man who already knew the ending. Then came his turn to speak. He stood up confidently, cleared his throat, and began a speech that sounded almost rehearsed. "My father needs help," he said. "This isn't about money. It's about protecting him." The irony almost made me smile. Protecting me, the same man he had tried to strip of everything. He spoke about responsibility, morality, family honor. I listened carefully, not because I cared for his words, but because I knew soon they would hang him by their own weight. When he finished, there was silence. The judge looked at me and nodded gently. "You may respond, sir," he said. My lawyer stood beside me, but didn't speak. This was my moment. Slowly, I reached into my bag and took out a small flash drive. It looked insignificant, a piece of plastic, barely noticeable. But inside, it was the truth that would end every lie he had told. I handed it to my lawyer, who passed it to the court clerk. The judge leaned forward slightly as the clerk connected it to the audio system. The first recording began. My son's voice filled the room, clear, confident, careless. "He's too old to know what's going on," the voice said. "Once the papers go through, everything will be in my name. He won't even understand what happened." The sound echoed through the courtroom, bouncing off walls and faces alike. Every head turned toward him, his face drained of color. His lawyer froze. The judge's eyes hardened. The voice continued. laughing, planning, confessing. There were gasps from the benches, the sound of pens dropping. Someone whispered, "My God!" But I stayed still. I didn't look at anyone. I kept my eyes on the floor, letting his words do what mine never could. The next recording played. Another confession, another moment of arrogance. "The old man's too trusting," he said. "By the time he figures it out, it'll be too late." I could feel my heart beating in my chest, not from fear, but from quiet justice. When the third recording ended, the room fell into complete silence. Even the air felt heavy. The judge leaned back, hands folded. My son tried to speak, stammering half-sentences that died in his throat. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, whispering something urgent, but it was useless. The damage was done. Truth had walked into the room, uninvited but undeniable, and it didn't need a lawyer to defend it. The judge broke the silence at last. His voice was calm but sharp. "This court has heard enough," he said. "These recordings speak for themselves." He looked at my son directly, not with anger, but with disappointment, the kind only truth can deliver. "What you've done," he said slowly, "is not just deceit. It is cruelty masked as care. You tried to steal not only his money, but his mind." My son lowered his head. His arrogance had collapsed under the weight of his own voice. The ruling came swiftly. The guardianship request was denied. The court ordered a full investigation into his financial conduct. My assets were legally restored to my control, protected under new terms that could never again be challenged. But more than that, my name, the one he had tried to tarnish, was cleared in front of everyone who once doubted me. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just closed my eyes and took one long breath, as if exhaling years of silence all at once. After the judge adjourned the session, I stood slowly and turned toward the door. People watched me as I walked past. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked ashamed for ever believing his lies. But I didn't stop. I didn't need apologies. The truth had already spoken for me. My son sat frozen, his face pale, his eyes lost. For a brief second, our gazes met. There was no hatred in mine, only calm, the kind of calm that says, "It's over." Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp and cool. I looked up at the gray sky, feeling lighter than I had in years. My lawyer joined me, saying softly, "You've done something remarkable today." I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "Truth did." He smiled faintly and nodded. We didn't speak again. Some victories don't need words. They just need silence deep enough to honor them. That evening, I returned home alone. The house greeted me like an old friend, familiar, forgiving, unchanged. I sat by the window with a cup of tea and replayed the moment in my mind. Not the courtroom, not the crowd, but the sound of his voice breaking under his own lies. That was the sound of closure. Not revenge, just justice finding its way home. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't tell the story to friends or neighbors. Some things are too sacred to be shared immediately. I simply wrote one line in my notebook: "The truth doesn't shout. It waits." Days passed. The world moved on. But for me, time stood still in that peaceful clarity. I had seen the power of truth laid bare. I had witnessed how patience, when guided by purpose, can rebuild dignity from ashes, and I learned that sometimes the loudest victory is the one that ends in silence. The days after the courtroom verdict felt strangely still. For years, every breath I took carried tension, like I was walking on glass, careful not to break under the weight of my son's manipulation. But now, the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy. It was clean. It was the silence that follows a storm, the kind where the air smells of rain and everything broken lies exposed under the soft light of morning. I had waited too long to feel that kind of peace, and I wasn't going to waste it. The first ripple came within hours of the verdict. By evening, the news had already spread. Small towns have a way of carrying whispers faster than wind. People who once avoided me now looked at me with wide, shameful eyes. I saw neighbors peeking through their curtains, pretending not to watch. Others came to my gate, pretending to deliver concern but really wanting to confirm what they had heard, that the man they thought had lost his mind had, in fact, uncovered the truth. I didn't correct them. I didn't say, "I told you so." I just nodded politely, letting their guilt do the speaking. The following day, the local paper printed a story. Elderly father wins case against son's false claims. The headline wasn't dramatic, but the article didn't need to be. It told the story plainly, that a son had attempted to declare his father mentally unfit to gain control of his property, and that recordings had proven deliberate deceit. They quoted the judge's closing remarks about greed and cruelty hidden behind family love. That line struck people harder than any law could, because it wasn't just about me. It was about every parent who had trusted too much, and every child who had taken advantage of that trust. Calls started coming in. Old friends, long lost in time and distance, reached out. Some apologized for believing the lies. Others simply said they were proud of me. I didn't need validation, but hearing their voices reminded me that the world still had good people, people who understood honor. A few even asked for copies of the case file to show to organizations that protect the elderly from exploitation. I agreed. If my pain could become prevention for others, then maybe it had a purpose after all. Meanwhile, my son disappeared from sight. His calls stopped, his messages stopped. Even his allies, the ones who had once sided with him, fell silent. I heard he had been questioned about his financial dealings and might face charges for forgery and fraud. I didn't celebrate. I didn't wish prison upon him. I had already punished him in the only way that mattered, by taking away the one thing he valued more than love, his reputation. He had built his image on control and confidence, and now both had crumbled publicly. That was enough. A week later, I went for a walk to the market. People stopped me along the way, not out of curiosity this time, but out of respect. Some bowed their heads, some offered a kind smile, and others simply said, "You did the right thing." But I didn't feel heroic. I wasn't proud of exposing my son. I was heartbroken that it had ever been necessary. No parent should have to fight their own child for truth. No father should have to turn love into evidence. Yet that was the life I had lived, and somehow survived. At home, I found myself walking through each room, touching the things that had once felt like ghosts of my past. The bookshelf, the old photographs, the piano my wife once played. For months, those objects had felt meaningless, overshadowed by betrayal, but now they felt alive again. They were proof that I had built something real, a home, a history, a legacy of honesty. He had tried to destroy that legacy with lies, but in the end, those lies only made my truth louder. As days turned into weeks, I noticed something unexpected. Peace didn't come from the court ruling. It came from forgiveness, the quiet kind that doesn't require words. I didn't forgive him for his sake. I forgave him for mine. Holding on to anger is like carrying poison and expecting the other person to suffer. I realized I had already suffered enough. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant refusing to let pain control the last chapters of my life. One afternoon, a letter arrived. The handwriting was familiar, shaky, uneven. It was from him. I held it for a long time before opening it, unsure if I wanted to read what was inside. When I finally did, the words were brief. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just thought you wouldn't understand." There was no apology, not really, just an excuse disguised as regret. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my drawer, right beside the recordings that had saved me. That was where it belonged, a memory of deceit, preserved but powerless. The next Sunday, I went to church for the first time in years. The priest recognized me immediately and asked if I would like to say a few words to the congregation. I declined. Instead, I sat in the back row, listening. He spoke about truth, about how light doesn't need to fight darkness, it just needs to exist. I smiled faintly, realizing how closely that mirrored my own story. I hadn't fought my son. I had simply stood in the light until his lies had nowhere left to hide. In the months that followed, I started writing again, not about my pain, but about lessons. I wrote essays for local magazines on dignity, aging, and justice. My words began to circulate, and people reached out asking for advice. Some shared their own stories of betrayal, fathers, mothers, grandparents who had faced similar cruelty. I answered every letter. I told them that revenge wasn't necessary when truth was on their side. Be patient, I wrote, because time is the greatest witness. Financially, I was secure again, but I no longer cared about money. I cared about purpose. I donated to legal aid groups that defend seniors. I supported organizations that educate families on elder rights. Each donation felt like reclaiming a part of what I had lost, not in wealth, but in faith. My lawyer once told me, "You've turned pain into power." But I didn't see it that way. I saw it as duty, a quiet responsibility to make sure no one else went through what I did. As for my son, the last I heard, he had moved to another city, working small jobs under assumed names. His charm had run out, his circle had shrunk, his pride had collapsed. Sometimes I imagined him looking at himself in the mirror, haunted by his own voice, the same one that had echoed through that courtroom. I didn't wish him suffering. I wished him understanding, because that is the heavier punishment, to live knowing you were the architect of your own downfall. One evening, as I sat watching the sunset, a neighbor's little boy came up to me. He had seen the newspaper months ago and said, "You're the man who told the truth, right?" I smiled and nodded. He handed me a flower, a small, imperfect one, and said, "My dad said you're brave." I looked at the flower, at the boy's innocent eyes, and felt something warm return to my chest. Maybe that's what all this was for. Not to win a fight, but to show the next generation that truth still matters. Now when I look back, I don't see a story of betrayal anymore. I see a story of awakening. My son's lies didn't destroy me. They refined me. They stripped away illusion and left behind something pure. The understanding that peace isn't found in love that betrays you, but in truth that stays. I'm not proud of what I had to do, but I am proud that I did it without hatred. The world will always have people who twist honesty for their own gain, but as long as there are those willing to stand for truth quietly, patiently, without surrender, the world still has hope. I am proof of that. The courtroom may have closed that day, but for me, the real verdict came after. In the silence that followed, in the calm that returned, in the peace that stayed. The real storm began after the courtroom ended. The judgment had only been the thunderclap. What followed was the slow rainfall of consequences. People in town talked for weeks, not loudly, not openly, but in whispers, glances, and quiet shifts in tone. The same people who once greeted my son with smiles now crossed the street when they saw him. Invitations stopped arriving. The admiration he had built through charm and deceit melted away, leaving behind a shadow where pride used to live. His workplace was the first to react. Word travels quickly in small circles of business. The recordings had spread beyond the courtroom. Someone had leaked them online. Colleagues who once laughed at his jokes now avoided his eyes. His manager called him in for a private discussion, but everyone knew what that meant. Within a week, his name was removed from the office door, replaced by someone else's. A man who once bragged about power now found himself stripped of every symbol of it: title, respect, trust. I didn't rejoice. I didn't smile when I heard the news. I sat in my chair, quietly watching the sunlight through the window. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was clarity. What he was facing wasn't my revenge. It was the echo of his own choices returning to him. When a man builds his life on lies, the truth doesn't need to chase him. It waits patiently until he stumbles into it himself. His friends began to drift away too. Those who had believed his stories now realized the truth, that the unstable old man was never the problem. They had shared drinks with him, listened to his gossip, nodded to his arrogance, and now they couldn't bear to look at him. A liar's world collapses quietly, not in an explosion, but in a slow, silent crumble. One friend at a time, one door at a time. until the only voice left is your own, echoing in the empty room you built with deceit. His mother's side of the family, who had once defended him blindly, also began to question everything. They reached out to me, calls filled with hesitation, guilt, and apology. Some asked for forgiveness for not believing me sooner. I didn't blame them. Lies are crafted to sound believable. Truth often sounds bitter. I told them not to feel sorry. Everyone sees clearly eventually. But sometimes the price of sight is pain. One day, I received a letter from the bank. It was addressed to both of us, but only I opened it. It contained the final notice for a loan he had taken, one he had forged under my old credentials. The investigation that followed the trial had uncovered more than we expected. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized. What little pride remained in him was now drowning under the weight of legal reality. I didn't interfere. I didn't pay off his debt. This time, he would face life without my safety net beneath him. The rope of consequence was his to climb or fall from. A few weeks later, I saw him for the first time since the hearing. He came to my house unannounced. He looked smaller, not in body, but in spirit. The arrogance that once clung to him like perfume had vanished. His eyes carried the dullness of a man who had lost too much too quickly. I didn't ask him to come in. He stood at the gate, unsure of what to say. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, but instead, he muttered something about needing help. I didn't speak. I just looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of sadness that words can't carry. Then I turned and walked back inside. That silence hurt him more than any argument ever could. After that day, he never returned. Word spread that he had moved to another city, living in a small apartment, doing odd jobs to survive. People said he was bitter, withdrawn, avoiding everyone who once knew him. I didn't chase him. I didn't try to reconnect. Sometimes love must end quietly, not because it's gone, but because it's been betrayed beyond repair. You can forgive a mistake, but you cannot rebuild trust from ashes. Meanwhile, life around me began to soften again. Neighbors came by more often. The community center invited me to speak about resilience and truth. I hesitated at first. I didn't want to sound like a man bragging about his scars, but I agreed. When I stood before the crowd, I didn't talk about my son's cruelty. I talked about silence, how it can be both a prison and a weapon. I told them that sometimes the most powerful way to fight lies is not by shouting, but by standing still long enough for the truth to find you. The room was quiet when I finished. People came up to me afterward, sharing their own stories. Children who had abandoned parents, parents who had been used, trust broken by greed. It was heartbreaking, yet healing. I realized I wasn't alone. The pain I thought was mine alone belonged to countless others who had never found the strength to speak. My story had given them permission to do so. Weeks turned into months. Seasons changed. I began to write letters, not to my son, but to myself. Letters of forgiveness, of remembrance, of clarity. I wrote about my wife, about the early days of fatherhood, about the joy of holding him as a child. I wrote about the mistakes I made, the times I gave too much, stayed too silent, trusted too deeply. Those letters became my therapy. I never mailed them anywhere. I kept them in a box under my desk, a record of everything that was real. Sometimes at night, I thought about him, not with anger, but with a strange, distant pity. He had spent his whole life chasing control, not realizing that the only control that matters is self-control. Power without integrity is hollow. Wealth without respect is noise, and success without love is just loneliness in a louder house. He had everything once, and he lost it all, not because I took it away, but because he gave it up piece by piece, with every lie he told. Then came the day that closed the circle entirely. I received a call from a lawyer, not mine this time, but his. He informed me that my son had listed me as his emergency contact after being hospitalized due to stress and financial collapse. I listened quietly. When the lawyer asked if I would visit, I said no. Not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say. I had stood before a court once to prove my sanity. Now life itself had proven his insanity, not of mind, but of soul. That night, I prayed for him. Not for his success, but for his peace. For the first time, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Betrayal had taught me something deeper, that forgiveness isn't for the one who hurt you, it's for the one who survived. The world moved on, as it always does. The whispers faded. The town forgot the headlines. But I didn't forget the lesson. I lived quietly, taking morning walks, feeding birds, reading in the garden. Each day, the sun rose the same, indifferent to our pain, yet healing in its warmth. I often wondered if my son looked at the same sun from wherever he was, realizing what he had lost. Years later, when I wrote my will, I left him nothing, not out of spite, but clarity. My estate went to charities, hospitals, and children's education funds. My name would continue, not through him, but through goodness, the kind he never learned to value. My lawyer smiled when he saw the papers. "You've closed the story," he said. I nodded. "No," I replied. "I've just written the ending it deserved." Now, in my old age, when people ask me if I regret anything, I say no. Not because it was easy, it wasn't, but because every scar on my heart became a lesson. I learned that truth doesn't just reveal others, it refines you. I learned that sometimes losing a son doesn't mean losing fatherhood. It means reclaiming yourself from the shadow of his choices. When I look at my reflection these days, I don't see a broken man. I see a survivor, a man who faced betrayal and didn't let it define him, a man who let truth do what vengeance never could, restore peace. And somewhere, deep in that peace, I know that if my son ever finds his way back to himself, he'll remember the day the world stopped believing his lies and started believing mine. Peace doesn't arrive suddenly. It doesn't knock. It doesn't announce itself. It creeps in slowly, one soft morning at a time, after all the noise has faded. In the months that followed my son's downfall, I began to understand what peace truly meant. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of acceptance. I didn't forget what he had done. I simply stopped letting it control my thoughts. My home, once heavy with betrayal, started to feel lighter again. The walls that had heard my heartbreak now echoed silence, the kind that heals instead of haunts. Each morning, I made a habit of sitting by the window with my cup of tea. The sunlight would pour through the curtains, painting the room gold. Birds perched on the fence outside, and I'd watch them flutter freely, unbothered by yesterday. They reminded me that life, no matter how wounded, keeps moving. I didn't need revenge anymore. I didn't even need reconciliation. I just needed stillness. That, I realized, was my form of victory. People in town treated me differently now. Not with pity, but with quiet respect. The man they once thought weak had proven that truth doesn't need youth. It needs patience. The local newspaper printed a small column about me a few weeks later. The father who fought lies with silence. I didn't ask for it, and I didn't need it. But reading it made me smile. I wasn't a hero. I was simply a man who refused to be erased. My lawyer visited occasionally, not for work, but for tea. He said my story had become an example in legal discussions, a case of dignity over deceit. He laughed once and said, "You've become a legend without trying." I told him legends are born of pain, not pride. We both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that knows too much about life to be loud. My health improved too. The constant weight on my chest lifted, and the nights of sleepless worry grew fewer. I began walking again, not far, just to the park down the street. The first time I went, a group of children were playing near the benches. One of them ran up to me and offered a flower, saying his grandmother told him I was a brave man. I took it, not because I believed I was brave, but because I wanted to honor her words. Sometimes the world gives you small signs that you're on the right path, even after losing so much. I started keeping a journal, not of events, but of thoughts, short reflections, small lessons. One entry read, "Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to survive." Another, "Forgiveness is not weakness. It's freedom from the chain the liar left behind. Writing became my therapy, my quiet rebellion against everything that tried to silence me. It felt like planting seeds in soil that had once been burned, proof that life can grow even after destruction. Months turned into a year. My son remained distant. I heard bits and pieces about him, small jobs, failed relationships, empty apologies sent to others, but never to me. I didn't hate him. I didn't wish for his suffering. I had already let go of that weight. In some strange way, I even hoped he'd find his way back to decency someday. But if he didn't, I was content knowing the cycle ended with me. I would not carry his cruelty forward, nor would I let it define my legacy. One afternoon, I received a letter from a charity organization I'd donated to after my case. They invited me to speak at an event for elder protection. I hesitated. I had lived my story, and reliving it wasn't easy. But something in me said this was necessary. When I stood before that small audience of gray-haired faces and kind eyes, I didn't talk about betrayal. I talked about awareness, about how silence, when used wisely, is not surrender. It's strategy. About how truth, when given time, turns even the deepest wounds into lessons for others. After the event, an elderly woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She told me her son had taken her savings and left her in a nursing home. "I thought I was alone," she whispered. I placed my hand on hers and said, "You're not. And you're not weak for believing in love. You're human." That conversation stayed with me for days. I realized then that my story was no longer just mine. It belonged to every parent who had been betrayed, every heart that had trusted too much, and every soul that needed proof that justice could exist without hatred. As the seasons passed, the bitterness that once lived inside me turned into wisdom. I found beauty in simplicity again. I cooked my own meals, tended my garden, fixed small things around the house. Each task, however small, reminded me that I was still capable, mentally sharp, emotionally alive, quietly undefeated. The house that once echoed with lies now hummed with peace. It no longer felt like a place of loss. It felt like a sanctuary. On quiet evenings, I'd sit on the porch, watching the sunset fade into a horizon of calm. Sometimes I'd think about my wife, her laughter, her patience, the way she would have handled all this. I often whispered, "You'd be proud of how I survived." In those moments, I didn't feel alone. The wind, the fading light, and the sound of my own steady breathing were enough. I kept my son's last letter tucked away in a drawer, the one where he had tried to explain, not apologize. I never tore it up, not because it mattered, but because it was part of the truth. It was a reminder that betrayal doesn't erase love completely. It only reshapes it into something quieter, more distant. Love remains, but it no longer burns. It glows faintly, like an ember that refuses to die. As time went on, people asked me if I ever regretted taking him to court. My answer was always the same. I didn't take him to court. I took the truth there. The difference is everything. I never wanted his punishment. I wanted my peace. And in achieving that, I realized something profound. That justice and peace aren't enemies. They're siblings. One brings closure, the other brings calm. Together, they rebuild what betrayal tried to destroy. Now, in my final years, my life is simple. I wake early. I write. I feed birds. I watch the world unfold slowly, beautifully, without drama. I still receive letters from people who heard my story. Some thank me. Some share their pain. I reply to each one, even if it's just a line or two. My words are always the same. Hold on to your dignity. Let time fight for you. And when I walk through the small town that once pitied me, I see the change. People smile differently now, not out of guilt, but out of respect. They greet me as Mr. Thomas, not that poor old man. It's a small thing, but it means everything, because respect earned through truth lasts longer than love built on lies. I know my journey is nearing its end. Age is no longer kind, but it is honest. My body slows, but my heart remains steady. I no longer fear death, because I've already lived through something worse, betrayal. and I've conquered it, not by fighting, but by staying true to who I was. When I leave this world, I don't want statues or stories. I just want people to remember that there was once an old man who faced lies with patience and proved that truth doesn't need youth, wealth, or strength. It only needs courage. And maybe, somewhere, my son will hear that story, not as shame, but as a lesson. A reminder that a father's silence is never weakness. It's often the sound of wisdom waiting for its moment. I have lived long enough to understand that life never gives back what it takes. It only teaches you how to live without what you lost. When I look back now, I no longer see my son's betrayal as the worst thing that ever happened to me. I see it as the moment that revealed who I truly was, not as a father, but as a man. A man who learned that love without respect is slavery, and silence without wisdom is suffering. What I went through was cruel, but it also stripped me of illusions. It forced me to rebuild my soul from the raw materials of truth. There was a time when I thought peace meant living without pain. Now I know peace means learning to carry pain without letting it break you. Every scar on my heart became a line in the story of who I am. I stopped asking why things happened and started asking what they taught me. That question changed everything. I began to see life not as a punishment, but as a long conversation between mistakes and mercy. The house I live in now is small, but it's enough. The walls are quiet, the air smells of coffee and old wood, and the mornings arrive like old friends, gentle, predictable, forgiving. I don't need much anymore. The world outside rushes forward, chasing things that vanish as quickly as they come. But I sit here, content with my slow pace. There's power in stillness that youth never understands. When you've seen life twist and turn the way I have, you learn that rushing doesn't lead you anywhere faster. It just makes you forget where you were heading in the first place. Sometimes people ask me if I miss my son. I always pause before answering. The truth is complicated. I miss the boy I raised, not the man he became. I miss the laughter we shared when he was young, the pride I felt when he took his first steps, the joy of watching him grow. But the man who tried to destroy me, that man I've already buried in my heart. He's gone, and I don't mourn him anymore. Grief, after all, is only for the living, not for the memories that died long ago. I often sit by my window and watch the seasons change. Each season feels like a mirror of my life. Spring reminds me of my youth, full of hope and foolish dreams. Summer feels like the years I worked, sweating and striving to build a name. Autumn is the time of realization, when I began to lose people and illusions. And winter is where I am now. But even in winter, there is beauty. The cold brings clarity, the silence brings honesty, and the snow hides scars the way forgiveness hides pain. One evening, while reading by the fireplace, I came across an old photograph. My son, as a child, standing next to me, smiling proudly, with his small hand gripping mine. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't cry. I just felt a quiet ache, like a song you've forgotten the lyrics to, but still hum without meaning to. I put the photo back in its frame and placed it on the shelf. It belonged there, not erased, not glorified, just accepted as part of the story. The older I get, the more I understand that truth is never loud. It doesn't need to shout, because lies eventually exhaust themselves. People often ask how I stayed calm through everything. The answer is simple. I trusted time. Time exposes what people try hardest to hide. It heals wounds that apologies never could, and it delivers justice to those who think they're clever enough to escape it. My revenge wasn't my plan. It was time's design. All I did was endure long enough for it to work. There's something else age has taught me, that forgiveness isn't for the one who hurt you. It's a gift you give yourself. When I forgave my son, I didn't excuse what he did. I simply refused to keep drinking the poison he poured into my heart. I stopped replaying the pain and started rewriting it into peace. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it gives you back the future. Without it, you stay chained to yesterday forever. I think often about the people who stood by me, The nurses who smiled when I had no strength to speak. The lawyer who believed in me when others called me delusional. The strangers who sent letters of encouragement after hearing my story. They remind me that humanity still exists, even when it hides behind walls of selfishness. The world isn't cruel. People are. But people can also be kind if you look in the right places. Some evenings, I walk to the park and sit near the old oak tree. Children play nearby, their laughter echoing across the open air. Watching them makes me wonder what kind of world they'll inherit. I hope it's one where truth is valued more than image, where love is measured by patience, not possessions. I hope parents like me will never have to defend themselves against their own blood. But if they do, I hope they'll find the courage to stand as I did, not with anger, but with evidence, not with rage, but with dignity. I've learned that life doesn't punish people, it teaches them. My son is probably learning that lesson somewhere right now. Maybe he's sitting alone, wondering where he went wrong. Maybe he's still blaming others. Maybe he's finally realizing that lies always end where they begin, in emptiness. I don't need to know. His journey is his own now. I've already completed mine. I don't keep much these days, just a few books, my journals, and a small box of letters. Among them is the last one I ever wrote to him, but never sent. It reads, "You took my name to court, but you couldn't take my peace. You took my words, but not my voice. You took my trust, but not my truth. One day, you'll understand that destroying someone's peace doesn't make you powerful. It just leaves you homeless inside your own soul. I never mailed it, because some truths don't need to be spoken. They just need to exist. Sometimes I wonder what people will remember when I'm gone. Maybe they'll remember my story. Maybe they won't. But if they do, I hope they remember not the betrayal, but the balance that followed. The way an old man stood quietly while the world doubted him, and then let the truth speak for itself. I hope they remember that you don't have to scream to be heard. You just have to stand long enough for lies to collapse on their own. Now, when I lie down at night, I no longer feel fear. My heart doesn't race. My mind doesn't wander. The same peace I fought for has become my companion. I dream less of the past and more of the calm that waits beyond it. Death doesn't scare me anymore because I've already faced something worse. The death of trust. The death of love. If I survive that, I can survive anything. Before I close my eyes each night, I whisper a simple prayer. Not for more years, but for more peace in the ones I have left. I thank the universe for teaching me, even through pain. I thank time for being fair, even when people weren't. And I thank the truth for being loyal, even when blood wasn't. If anyone ever reads my story, I hope they take one message from it. Never let betrayal turn you bitter. Let it turn you brave. Because in the end, dignity is the only inheritance that never loses value. You can lose your wealth, your family, your strength, but if you keep your truth, you've already won. My son told everyone I was unstable, but the truth, in the end, was perfectly steady. And so I live quietly now, in a world that once tried to silence me. I don't need applause, forgiveness, or validation. I just need mornings that begin with peace and nights that end without regret. I've learned that the truest revenge is a calm heart, one that no betrayal can shake again.